April 30th, Mars enters the sign of Aries. 24 hours earlier, Venus entered the sign of Taurus, and we have the two planets, Venus and Mars, that do so much in our world and make the world go round, enter in the signs where they belong and where they feel at home. With Mars in Aries, it is about the impulsive warrior, sword and shield, that is at the forefront of the story. Mars and Aries will be there all the way into the first week of June. I'll talk about a couple dates here. Let's jump into this fire story that really encapsulates the eclipse story that happened all through the month of April. Here, on April 30th, 8:32 a.m. Pacific, Mars enters Aries, impulsive, full of courage, as always with Mars, but in its own sign of Aries, where now there is no filters, and there must be something that is done, something achieved by Mars and Aries. It must challenge itself into the world with sword and shield as a warrior. The direction of willpower is at the all-time high. This is one way to take a look at it. Remember, we can't forget the impulsiveness of all this, how it's instinct-based, not thinking-based, doing-based. Mars burns hot and quick, rapidly, like a raging fire that starts instantly, but then can go right out. Most importantly, though, you have to remember this, that it's competitive and needs a challenge. The fight is everything about Mars and Aries. Being in the trenches of whatever the situation is, Mars must put its will into the world first and foremost, and it will use any tool possible to do this. Now, this is great when it comes to initiating stories that came out of the eclipses of April. And Mars here, with the rest of the month into June, is going to touch upon some of those places that were brought up during the April 8th eclipse, the Mercury retrograde that happened in Aries, and Venus's transit that happened in Aries. And all those little factors have a single thread through them all, not because they're in Aries, but because Chiron is in Aries too, and so there's a wounded story to all this. But I think there's a progression in the wound, but it depends on how it's dealt with. Is it dealt with sword and shield? Is it dealt with caustic maneuvers and actions? Or is there a tactical way of using this? So, with that said, let's go into an important day, which is May 3rd, when Mars and Aries will sextile. That's an opportunistic relationship with the planet Pluto in Aquarius within days of its ingress at 2:06 a.m. Pacific. And here we talk about the strength of Mars, the courage of Mars that's regenerated by Pluto. This is a possibility. But the other thing is about Pluto is the subject matters when dealing with depths, things behind the scenes, things that are secret. And here I think Mars brings a deep tactical tool. And I'm using, fighting warlike references here because it is the god of war. And we have to remember that this is part of the story with Mars and Aries. This isn't, in a sense, a negotiation, right? And negotiating is for Venus and Libra, but Mars has to learn some negotiating tactic here, and I think it might have in certain parts of the eclipse story, but it's a raw planet in a sign that first and foremost, it's for the battle, and it must taste sweat, the blood, and the thrill of victory. And even when defeat comes, the honor that comes with something like that. So when we get to May 3rd, mentioned here earlier in the graphic, strength regenerated, a deep tactical story tool is used. We remember courage and a deeply passionate focus. Pluto will bring the focus to Mars here in the sextile aspect. And remember, sextile is an opportunity. Here is air and fire stirring up Mars to bring it a new mind tool. All right, so when we get to the next major aspect, it's almost a couple weeks later that happens, a little less than that, I think, here on May 19th, when Mars in Aries will actually be conjunct the North Node in Aries. And this is important because the eclipse stories always happen with the north and the south node. So saying that, we will look into we'll look into May 19th, Mars conjunct the north node. This is the same degree, by the way. This is the same degree, the 14-degree north node, that Mercury here recently, when it came out of its retrograde cycle for 3 weeks, it stopped going retrograde at 14 degrees. And Mars is touching the north node here at this placement. So this should tell you right here that some of the stories that were brought up during the Mercury retrograde in Aries, the eclipse that happened on April 8th, the Chiron in Aries story, the Venus in Aries story that happened. And if you're an Aries and a Libra, especially the two of you, sun sign, planets in that sign, or rising signs in those two signs, you're affected by this. And so some of the things that were discussed, some of the things that arose and were inflamed out of the Aries eclipse story, Mars will be touching upon this. And in a sense, is it a fight situation where Mars is fighting for the Aries part of one's chart, for the story that is like brought itself up about will and independence and the courage for one's own story and the way they relate in the world to put themselves first? It definitely is on point. I will stop here and say that this entire Mars and Aries transit that it's going to happen, on paper with some of the other dates I'm going to give you, it looks pretty good. But I'll tell you, from a bigger level, Mars will be touching upon every single point that all these other planets have done. The eclipse, Venus, Mercury retrograde. And I think here is where one must be cautious of how they utilize Mars or how Mars happens to them. And you have to understand metaphorically what sword and shield is, whether you wield one or you wield it to defend, that's part of action, that is part of doing. It's also part of negotiation that happens in situations, that knowing that there's something at stake and that you must have a defensive and offensive postures. It's just how you do it. Does it come from anger and pain? And do you do it in a smart way, or is that a lashing out? So when we reach this point of the North Node and where Mercury stationed forward, got the sun coming in here, I'm getting shined, we'll get right here, the same degree there, this is something to pay attention to with even how we're dealing with communication, because at the same time we have Mercury coming out of retrograde going over the same degrees. I wrote, Mars conjunct North Node in Aries, profound thirst to fulfill. Okay, the thirst of Mars, and it's profound because we're dealing with the North Node here, and in a sense, what we want, what we're going after, and there's nothing else but that goal. And there's an eclipse realization because it pretty much hits where the eclipse point was, where the node was. On April 8th, it was at 15 degrees. We're pretty close there. You'll see the next slide. But here's the willpower forged is what I wrote here. That's very important to remember. Again, how you're forging, how you're wielding sword and shield metaphorically is key here, okay? So in a sense, within that 24 hours, we get into the 20th. From May 19th to the 20th, we get into basically a situation here where Mars is at 15 degrees, the same place where the North Node was when the April 8th eclipse happened. Okay, so 19th and 20th are really critical here because there's fires raging here, and can it be focused? Can it use the tools that it did when it encountered Pluto here to be smart and use tactics involved when dealing with the so-called quote-unquote fight? Okay, and I'm skipping here, but I want to go back. I want you to see something here because I wrote here on the 19th and the 20th, you must be careful. Unleash the fury, smashing of everything, fighting. Okay, so it's here. It's here where Mars hits a critical point here because we have to remember the North Node a lot of times is what sometimes it's referenced as the head of the dragon. It's all consuming. It just cannot stop but go after and get. It's not a purging place, it's a go after place. And so if Mars is hitting that point from the eclipses and so on and so forth, and there's a story of one putting one's own will and will do whatever it takes to accomplish this courageously and sometimes in blind fire fury, This is something you have to pay attention to. And I would not doubt that week that you saw things that it really accelerated on the world mundane level. And just look at the people around you and look at situations. You're really going to see this if you're Aries, Libra rising, or you have planets in Aries and Libra, and even other cardinal signs like Cancer or Capricorn, okay? But again, this is a critical moment when Mars hits the North Node 19th in the same degree, 15 degrees, where the node was on the April 8th eclipse. Very important. Let's get to another important date, which is the 26th of May. And it is when Mars it will hit 19 degrees Aries at May 25th, 6th, 7th. This is big because this was the same degree that the April 8th eclipse occurred at. Remember, the April 8th eclipse was the sun and moon. It was a new moon in Aries at 19 degrees, along with Chiron in Aries here. And Mars will hit that point that week. And again, so the second half, we build up with Mars. We build up to the second half in the month where Mars it could be smart, but it will be, in one sense, could be uncontrollable. No one controls Mars. Mars does what it wants, when it wants, impulsively, instinctually, intensely, right? So this is a way of being aware / warning / could be utilized and focused to get certain things done in the Aries part of one's chart if they're affected by this. Again, if you want to know more about this, you can hit me up with a reading with this, because I think the transits from now all the way into June, with Venus going into Taurus, Mars going into Aries, are really applicable. And if there's some guidance that you're looking for astrologically, remember, you can hit me up and get a session and we could talk about stuff like this. Okay. So on the 26th, I mentioned the eclipse point at 19 degrees. Okay. We'll go here to the 29th, which is a huge moment in all this. And it just seems like it doesn't let up these transits, but I actually think that there are constructive moments this month. And the reason is at the 29th at 10:08 a.m. Pacific, Mars will conjunct Chiron in Aries at 22 degrees. And here I wrote, the wound can be merged into self. And what am I saying there? You know, a lot of times when we're dealing in a simple way with the Chiron and Aries story, wherever Chiron is, it's kind of like a mysterious, unseen self at times that we are always dealing with, and sometimes is reflected towards us in the outside world. Like the wound of Chiron, the wound that we cannot see, sometimes we see in other people, and we have a connection to something like that in the process of that. Or we do figure it out, and we do see that in the Aries part of our chart. And there's been the story brewing here for the last year and a half with Chiron and Aries, even all the way to last spring when we had our first eclipse. We had our first eclipse in Aries that start the Aries Libra eclipse cycle. And I think there's possibly been a lot of growth here if you are having a Chiron return, you have Chiron in Aries, or you have certain degrees here in Aries that are any planets or anything that are in the mid degrees, like let's say 22 degrees here. And I think there is emerging here, and I think it could be extremely beneficial and extremely positive, and feel like there's an evolutionary type of step you're taking in your world here in the Aries part of your chart. So the wound could be merged into self. The wound becomes a new source of strength. And that everything that Mars has gone through here at this point in the transit, with the eclipse story and the Mercury retrograde that happened, and Venus in Aries and Chiron itself, there is movement here. And I think if one looks at this as something, as a new source of strength, one can actually forge their metaphorical sword or that wound and finish a new level of merging the wound into yourself, where not only are you healing the wound, but the wound now has possibly become a strength and tool in your life to propel yourself to the goals that you want, your will, your intention, your intensity, the impulsive nature of Aries, what you need to get things done for yourself in the world to survive. So I think this is a critical point here, considering everything else I talked about so far on this video. I think it's very poignant that Mars hits Chiron, but it first needed to go through certain places, the eclipse points, and touch upon Pluto, right? Get Pluto's help and the North Node and some of these places here. So that happens on the 29th. The wound becomes a new source of strength. Okay. And when we get to the 5th and 6th of June, at this point, can you believe it? We're already June. Mars will touch 27 degrees Aries, and this is the degree when Mercury first went retrograde in Aries on April 1st, a week before the eclipse. So for me, this is very important. It's a very important place because now we just reviewed and went through some growth possibly here and possibly some fighting and caustic behavior in the world. But here's a point where basically a lot of the themes from basically, we're talking June 5th here, so we're going to say 2 months now from pretty much the end of March all the way to this point. Mercury was in Aries, did the huge retrograde cycle. Mars is going to hit at a certain point here, and I think things will be very clear at this point of how it is all transpired. And I don't think even in the month of May, with Mars being in Aries and Venus being in Taurus, that there's going to be any confusion. I think these two planets being in their own home, their own domicile, as they say, where they both flow as two planets, Venus and Taurus, Mars and Aries, both ruling the North Node, Aries, ruling the South Node, Libra, that I think regardless of the story, whether it's good or bad or challenging or great, things are very clear the further we go into May. And Mercury will be, out of Aries, gone through its reviewing everything out of the retrograde, and we have a certain type of movement. The thing to remember is to apply Mars and Aries when you need to, and apply Venus and Taurus and the stability and the tranquility that Venus and Taurus likes, and know when to use them at certain times. But the reality is you cannot avoid Mars and Aries situations. If you're going to learn anything from this transit, is knowing when to quote unquote fight for you. Know when to tactically, offensively maneuver something at the right times. You might crash and burn a couple times because you didn't think it through, and that's part of the Mars and Aries story. But regardless, things must evolve and move forward in the Aries part of your chart. So again, Mars touches the 27th degree, and on June 8th and 9th, Mars will leave Aries and enter in Taurus, and that's a whole nother story and a whole nother video. Again, let's just quickly sum up. Warrior mentality. And sometimes you got to swing the sword and use the shield. But if your intention is for the good of you, for your own goal, your prophecy to fulfill, then you must do whatever it takes to get it done. Remember, on the other side, you can never forget about Venus, and Venus can never forget about Mars. So if you're going to pull anything here from right now into the first week of June, this is the month. Venus and Taurus, Mars and Aries. If you want to know more about Venus and Taurus, I made another video. I'm going to put it right here. You can take a look at it and watch it. Besides that, if it's your first time here, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell. And I'm Sparkles of Gold, and I'll see you on the next video.